Mark Graban, it is so lovely to have you on the podcast today. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Alisha. Thanks for inviting me.
So, I am just over the moon to have you on the show today because you have a podcast about one of my favorite topics in the whole wide world, and it's called My Favorite Mistake.
Yes.
Tell me, yes, I love it. Yes, and for those
My coffee
watching,
mug. Yeah.
yeah, for those listening, Mark just lifted his mug, and what does it say?
Well, it's the My Favorite Mistake logo. And then maybe later, if you want, there's some sort of mantras on the other side of the mug that might be fun to explore.
Oh, we should definitely do that. So, can you tell me, how did your podcast, My Favorite Mistake, get started?
Well, yeah, there's a couple elements to it. I mean, I've been fascinated by this idea of learning from mistakes for a while now. You know, the core of the work that I do professionally as an engineer turned consultant is around helping people improve, helping organizations improve. And there's a methodology, a lot of this is built off of that is often referred to as lean manufacturing, or people might have heard of what's then sometimes called lean startup or lean healthcare, which is where I've ended up working. And I started this project, I was probably about 20, it was about 5-6 years ago, about 20 years into my career. And I kind of noticed a pattern where, you see people sharing things at conferences or posting things online. And, with experience, like there's an opportunity to try to coach or mentor others that don't have as much experience or are new to a field or to a practice. But at the same time, like I would catch myself sometimes being snarky about it. And that's not good. That's not helpful. That's not a good look for me. And so, I was reflecting on some of that. And the concept of the book Practicing Lean it's for one, it's borrowing a word that's used in realms like medicine. Well, doctors get to say they're practicing medicine, or practicing law is commonly used. In your realm, yoga, practicing yoga, right?
Yeah.
You don't learn yoga or learn medicine to a point where there's not anything more to learn, right? And then
The rabbit hole is deep.
It is. And the more you learn, the more you know you don't know. There's those cycles there. So I wrote a couple of stories, chapters, essays about mistakes I made in the first couple of years of my career. Mistakes that stuck with me or had enough of an impact where, I reflected and said, well, I think I've learned to avoid repeating those mistakes. I've grown personally and professionally. But I think sharing those mistakes and what I wish I had done differently, in the spirit of when we're all new to something, we're bound to make mistakes due to lack of knowledge, lack of knowing how to practice well or not being practiced. And then I invited a lot of people I knew and a couple of people I didn't know so well. 15 other authors all contributed chapters of their kind of early career mistakes and lessons learned. And as a reminder to people, or again, mainly as a reminder to me, be careful when criticizing people who are new to a field or to a discipline. So that project is, was sort of, inspired by some of those thoughts and feelings. All of the proceeds from the book are donated to a nonprofit that I'm on the board of called the Louise Batts Patient Safety Foundation. And so it's that project was a labor of love. It was an experiment in self-publishing. It was all sorts of things. But then, fast forward to 2020, I've been doing a podcast about what we call lean. It's called Lean Blog Interviews because I started with a blog and then I started doing podcasting, and that name is a bit of a mistake. It's clunky, right? Lean Blog Interviews. I don't know. I could have come up with a better name. Lesson learned there. But when you've had a podcast for a while, I don't know if this is happening for you now, Alisha, PR firms will find you and will start pitching guests. And sometimes these pitches are quite generic. They're blasting them out to lots of shows. Okay, that's fine. And I would either just delete them, or sometimes I would reply and say, that person sounds great, but my podcast is very niche and they're probably not a fit. So like if you were doing a podcast about yoga, like you might maybe accept a guest who talks about meditation. Why did I say medication? That's me working in healthcare. another mistake. You might have something that's maybe adjacent to the core. I don't know if that's a good example, but then if somebody wanted to come on and talk about keto diets and weight loss, you might say, well, that's not my show.
Yeah.
Right. And during the relative first couple of months of the pandemic, I was working from home and trying to find different ways to keep busy. And I would get these pitches. And then one day a pitch came in offering a chance to interview Kevin Harrington, who was one of the first sharks on the show Shark Tank. He was on season 1. I thought, I would love to meet him. I would love to interview him. Let me find a way to say yes instead of having to keep saying no. And so I bounced a couple ideas off of a couple of PR firms. Like it could be just a very general business podcast. But then I also had this idea, and I love the Sheryl Crow song, My Favorite Mistake.
I was going to ask you about that.
It is, I love that song. I think she's singing about a love mistake. My podcast is about business mistakes. But so anyway, Kevin Harrington was open to being a guest. And so we recorded it. He was great. Because I was afraid, like, I don't want someone to come on and say, my favorite mistake is that I'm just too awesome and success comes too easily to me. And they're like, no, that's not interesting to talk about. But he told a story about a mistake in his telemarketing infomercial career that could have bankrupted his company. Wow. And how he learned from it. And I thought how powerful that somebody who is so successful would have, we could frame it as courage or humility or vulnerability to talk about a mistake from their past and what they've learned and how they've moved forward. Because that's the spirit of the podcast. It's not mocking people for making mistakes, because we all make them. Right. And if there's people out there who think, maybe I'd be curious how common this mindset is, like, people who are really successful probably haven't made mistakes. And I think, well, probably the opposite is true. They've probably made more mistakes. And this is why I love the framing for your book, Alisha. They've probably had lots of little failures that they learned from to help prevent big failures.
Yeah. And I think you probably, I'm curious what you think about this then. I mean, one of the things I've started saying is that our little failures are actually our best kept success secrets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'm really fascinated by that. And the tie-in specifically to the beginner mindset, mm-hmm. because I'm wondering if when you started to reframe how you spoke to beginners, I'm wondering, I've always heard it put that the beginner mind has the best insights. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you've been able to see that, if that's true.
I think it's true. And I think whether it's mentoring or learning, like learning should be happening in all directions, right? So the one example would be, let's say in a corporate setting, typically the older person mentors the younger person. But maybe a better form of mentoring is this sort of, bi-directional or multi-directional mentoring, where of course the younger person has things to teach the older person.
Yeah.
I've had kind of a loose, well, it's not a group. Some people might call it a mastermind group, or it's just more of a it's informal. It's not a paid mastermind program, but a group of podcasters who I know, and a couple of people were invited, as a friend of a friend. And we meet every couple of months, and we have a group on Facebook where we share and compare things. And in that group, we've tried to have that spirit of, I've been podcasting for 16 years. That doesn't mean I know everything. We've got people in the group who had just started podcasting in the past year, right? So somebody who's new might be, not just might be, can and is teaching me some of the newer things where I might be set in my ways. Experience of, maybe repeating the same things over and over isn't necessarily better. So I totally agree with you. Like we all have something to learn from each other.
Yeah. All right. How did you get into the healthcare piece of things? I'm so fascinated by that
Yeah.
because
Uh,
you have, and I'm curious about it a lot because you're such an entrepreneur.
mhm.
And so I'm wondering what came first for you and where is the passion?
Yeah, yeah, I had not moved away totally from corporate life at that point. So in my career, I mean, I started off thinking I was going to work for big companies my whole career. I started my career at General Motors, and then 2 years later, went to grad school. Taking that job at General Motors was a favorite mistake in a way. I went to grad school, and that was very much focused on business and manufacturing, and have a career progressively, hopefully moving up the leadership ranks in probably big companies. But when I was in grad school at MIT, I got my eyes open to this whole world of entrepreneurship, which I really didn't have any exposure to growing up. And that was a great opportunity. Now, I took my first job out of grad school at a large, faster growing company, so smaller than GM, faster growing. I took a job at Dell Computer, which was also a favorite mistake in some different ways. But I met, so that wasn't really, I was having doubts about this bigger company environment. And being in Austin, Texas, a big startup entrepreneurship town, I met a founder of a company, and I joined a software startup company in late 2000. And that was my first kind of dip into entrepreneurship. And then after ups and downs of that, I kind of overcorrected and went back to another big company. And then quickly realized, oh wait, yeah, I left this environment for all the reasons.
Mhm.
And then so then how did I get involved in healthcare? Back in 2005, through a local networking group in Phoenix, where I was working at the time, there was a local networking group of people who did this lean manufacturing type of work at different large non-competing companies. And we would get together and visit each other's facilities and compare notes. And one of those opportunities then was a visit hosted by two women who had left Motorola, and they were doing work with a hospital in Scottsdale. So we got to go visit and see what they were doing to apply these methodologies around engineering and management and systems and continuous improvement to healthcare. That was really eye-opening, because again, I think I would have never thought
Yeah, me
that this
either.
would apply. And so then summer of 2005, my wife got a job offer that meant moving to Texas, which meant I was going to have to change jobs. And then right place, right time, I got contacted by a recruiter from Johnson & Johnson who was looking to hire people into a consulting group that they had that worked out in the field with medical labs and hospitals. So I thought, well, this would be really my first job as an external consultant instead of really being kind of on the inside. This would be my first opportunity to work in healthcare. And I thought, and when you think about potential mistakes, maybe this is a helpful framing. I kind of asked myself, like, what's the worst that can happen?
Mm-hmm.
If I try this and I don't like it, if I try this and I can't adapt to a different environment, I could probably still find a job back in what I thought my old career path was, but I'll probably learn things along the way.
Yeah.
And as it's turned out, instead of maybe like a detour, it was more of an off-ramp. I wasn't running from manufacturing, but the opportunity to work in healthcare was, it's just an opportunity I was thankfully in a position to take advantage of. Because if I hadn't had that opportunity to go visit the hospital in Scottsdale, if it hadn't piqued my interest, if I hadn't built some confidence of, yeah, these skills are transferable, if I'd only been at that other company for a year, which maybe resume-wise might have looked a little too soon to leave, things lined up in a way that I'm very thankful for.
Lots of kismet there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. All right. I wanted to kind of turn the tables a little bit. I know you probably get asked this question a lot, but I am curious what your favorite mistake is.
Yeah. So I kind of alluded to, I can share a couple of those. So, yeah. I mean, I say taking that job at General Motors was a favorite mistake because the first year there was awful. It was a really toxic work environment before people used that word, I think, right? long story short, that first year was really bad. It had me questioning all sorts of things of like, what kind of jobs or career am I really looking for? Is this really how adults behave in the workplace? Like it was rough. But the two things that made that then a favorite mistake, and I'm glad I stuck with it, right? Because it might have been a mistake to quit that job after the first year. Because here's what I would have missed out on. So in that job, there were some great people there, of course. And one of those people who I was mentoring me and I was learning a lot from had gone to a program at MIT. At the time, it was called Leaders for Manufacturing. Now, I already had in my mind, I thought I wanted to go get an MBA. I thought I would go to business school, but I was in Michigan. So I thought, well, University of Michigan, or maybe go back to Northwestern where I did my undergrad, great schools. I think I could have gotten it, I was thinking, well, those are schools that I could get into and have a great education. But Steve really thankfully encouraged me to pursue this program at MIT. He knew that it would be a good fit for me and vice versa. And MIT would have never been on my radar. I mean, not just maybe because it's East Coast, but even though I had the engineering and technical background, like it wasn't something I was thinking about. So I am really, really grateful for one to have that experience. And then thankfully that second year at General Motors, they brought in a new plant manager who had been at GM a long time, but had the opportunity to learn really deeply from Toyota in a joint venture plant that GM and Toyota ran together for about 20 years. He was a breath of fresh air. And to see how a different leadership style could start to turn a place around. Like, so without being there, without staying there, I wouldn't have been exposed to all of that. So I describe my GM experience, at least, for one, as being a favorite mistake. Can I take a minute and share
Yes,
the other
I
one?
want to hear the other one, but before you do, I kind of want to put a pin in this because I coach so many clients that they're in jobs that either they're not the right fit for them or it's a toxic work environment. And I think what's so beautiful about the story that you just shared is that there's always gold. If you're willing to look for it in the things that we think are horrible sometimes. And so I really appreciate you sharing that specific story, because I know so many clients that might even be listening to this right now that are in these work environments that are not the right fit. And I just want them to remember that there is still something positive there if they continue to look for it. And it reminds me of like the Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In is absolutely it's complex. It's a complicated book for lots of different reasons, but there's something that she talks about in that book that I think is so important. It's the idea of to not leave the table until you're done. And it sounds to me like in that scenario, even though you weren't happy, you didn't leave the table.
Right. And I could have, and that's the thing of, I've interviewed people who've talked about mistakes of leaving a job too soon, staying with the job too soon. Either of those, like the action or the inaction, or, not leaving a job is a choice, it's an action.
Right.
Either of those could be a mistake. And I'm not saying this is the only question to consider, but to think through risks or trade-offs, the risk of leaving versus the risk of staying. I think might be helpful to think through. It doesn't mean we have a crystal ball, but as we try to make these decisions, I think it's important to think and recognize I very well might make a mistake. So how would I course correct from that? Like I thought about that when I took that first job in healthcare. I'm like, well, this could be a mistake.
Right.
I'm not taking it because I think it is a mistake, right? But there was a backup plan. I'm like, well, maybe after stick with it for a couple of years, because at that point I didn't want a resume that showed a lot of job hopping. So yeah, I could have gotten out of that. Like I could have maybe stayed at J&J and worked back in their manufacturing, or I could have gotten back into a manufacturing job someplace else.
Yeah.
I agree with what you're saying, though, of hopefully there is some gold to be found. I don't know. Always, I don't know. I mean, if it's really truly not there, then maybe it is time to move on.
Right. We get scared though sometimes, there's so much fear involved in the leaving piece of things. All right, but I definitely want to hear your other mistake.
Sure. So, well, let me tell you just real briefly, like the one story that I led with in the book Practicing Lean was about, it was still it wasn't my first year of my career. It was still in the first decade of my career. But when I worked for that last manufacturing company, I was going through a certification program and I had to do a project. And, the culture there was not one of really engaging the frontline employees in change. It was still like a very expert driven culture. So as an engineer going through the certification, they're like, all right, expert, go in and fix things. And I felt kind of uncomfortable with it, right? I wanted to engage people. I take some ownership, though, of not doing, maybe not fighting hard enough on that. So kind of going along with the predominant culture, I was doing a lot of it myself. I wasn't engaging people. I wasn't getting input. I wasn't collaborating enough. And the project that I did worked well enough to get certified, but it really didn't have any lasting impact. And so the lesson learned is to fight harder or not get into a situation that would be similar. So as a consultant, I really guard against saying, if somebody said, well, we want to hire you to come in and fix it for us. I don't want to do that.
Right.
So there's a lesson learned from that.
Yeah. Like within the collaboration and being able to bounce ideas off of each other, ask people what their main problems are. That's where the learning is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. And what are their ideas? Can you get agreement that there's a problem? Sometimes people don't agree that there's a problem. But that engagement leads to buy-in, like buy-in, and people use that phrase. How do we get people to buy into change? That's not something you install at the very last minute. Like that buy-in is created along the way through engagement. And I learned, I think, some lessons about that by reflecting on something I would consider to be a favorite mistake. But then there's one other story that's shorter than, or I don't know if you had a follow up on that other story. But
do tell, please.
Okay. So I'd already mentioned I left that job at Dell Computer after just under 2 years. Met some, got to do some cool work, but I realized I don't think this is a fit for me culturally. I couldn't envision a career there. But working there, I met my wife. We had our 20th anniversary last October. So we met. She was not also a Dell employee. I know this could be a mistake. Dating somebody you work with, or the risk, probably the hard thing is breaking up if you break up with somebody you work with.
Yeah.
But she was there working for a large consulting firm on a project with a huge team. So literally our first interaction was an email, scheduling a meeting, and the first time we ever met was in a little conference room.
And then, really good story.
And then I'll do the Seinfeld thing, and then yada yada yada, we get married. And, so I shouldn't yada yada that, but if I hadn't taken that job at Dell Computer, I wouldn't have met my wife, and so that is certainly the workplace. The career decision is a favorite mistake.
I love that so much. Well, and it's funny you bring that up. So my boyfriend bought the house next to mine in 2020, and we started dating almost immediately. And I remember thinking, oh man, if we break up, he lives right next to me.
Yeah.
But I think it's going okay. So
yeah, it's awkward going out to get the mail and okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm also curious if you've heard a story on your podcast that is one of your favorite mistake stories that you want to share.
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
There are a lot of them.
Let me share though. Episode 2 was somebody I had reached out to. I had a chance to meet him personally when we lived in San Antonio, because he's a friend of a neighbor and close friend of ours. He was at the time a member of Congress from Texas, Representative Will Hurd. And he had already announced, so he served 2 terms in the House and then decided he was going to retire from the House and go back to the private sector for probably all the reasons. And he was a Republican from Texas, and he left. And so I knew he was on his way out of office. So I reached out through his press office. I'm a friend of so-and-so. I've met Representative Hurd. I host this podcast. I figured all I could do is ask, right? Like, they would either delete the email or say, no, I'm sorry, he can't do that because he's got to be on Face the Nation. Like, he's on all the main news shows being interviewed and commenting on things, even while he was in office. I'm just this little startup podcast. But he said yes. And so I was thrilled about that. And he told a story. His favorite mistake was the first time he ran for Congress. He, in the primary, was he was the top vote getter, but he didn't get 50%. So it went into a runoff between him and one other candidate. And as he told the story, like, he basically discounted and chose not to listen to advice from his political consultants about the strategy for the runoff. Like, he thought, I won the most votes the first time, I'm going to just keep doing more of what I'm doing. He lost the runoff.
Oh, man.
And what I really appreciated in his telling of that story is that he took responsibility for the decision. He admitted it was a mistake. He didn't throw others under the bus or try to blame them, which I'm sure that happens a lot in many workplaces. I'm sure it happens in politics. So he learned from that, though. And when he ran again 2 years later, if I remember right, it also went to a runoff, and he followed the strategy because he learned, and his consultants were trying to tell him, a runoff, when it's you versus one other person, requires a different strategy than you versus a field of competitors. And he listened and he won.
That's a great story.
I love that story. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those stories set the bar high then for everybody else. And I didn't know how many people are going to want to talk about mistakes. And thankfully, it's been a lot of people, yourself included.
Yeah, I was so when I started kicking around the idea of failure or mistakes or setbacks, these challenges that we think nobody else has or no one else has ever encountered before. I was so surprised I have a morning writing group, a morning group coaching call. We write and then we talk about what comes up. And when we first started talking about this topic, I mean, we talked about it for like 2 weeks straight. Like, we couldn't shut up about it, oh yeah, well, I hate talking about failure, and this is why, and this is what it brings up for me. And if I think about failure differently, this is what so it became this whole thing. And I was like, wow, we all are kind of secretly obsessed with mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, and hopefully obsessed with, like, not dwelling on what we've done, but like finding, and I'm trying to get better at this, like trying to find a proper level of reflection.
Yeah.
And then thinking about, what am I going to do differently? Because there's all sorts of mistakes. I think, like, for the first time you're thrown into a situation that you don't expect, you might make a mistake. And then you can process it and be better prepared for the next time you face that situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but not beating yourself up, or not being too hard on yourself. I don't think like totally brushing it off and saying, well, things happen. It was meant to be. What can you do? Like, well, I think you can reflect and learn and grow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, is there anything else you would like to share today?
Well, I was thankful to have you on my podcast, because I think the alignment between what you write about as little failures and the mindsets on the My Favorite Mistake podcast are incredibly aligned. And I think there's important mindsets. Oh, can I read the coffee mug too?
Oh yes, the mantras, please.
Because these mantras, and I'll thank my friend Karen Ross, who was also one of my first guests on the podcast, who kind of helped me think through and process this. And I think this is really highly aligned to what you write about. So it says here on the mug, 4 simple statements. And I intentionally had the mug made. I typically drink my coffee right-handed. So I'm not looking at my cartoony face. I'm looking at the mantras. So it says first, be kind to yourself. Mm. Nobody is perfect. We all make mistakes. The important thing is continuing to learn from our mistakes. And I think those are helpful reminders to me, and hopefully to others.
Gosh, we all need to plaster that on like our computer, our coffee mugs, our mirror. Sure. That's very poignant. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks for letting me share it.
Yeah. Well, I've got one more question for you that I ask everybody who comes on the show. How do you live a life of abundance?
That's a great question. I love the idea of I don't want to live life as a zero-sum game, scarcity mindset. Mm-hmm. I win, you lose. Mm-hmm. That I don't like that. I do try to practice more of this, abundance mindset of, if we all help each other, we all win. We can grow the pie instead of splitting up the pie, differently. So I think an example is like, I think, well, you and I think are demonstrating, here where I don't see your book as competitive to my podcast. I want people to read your book, and people who read your book then may, in a way, through learning about you and things, then they may learn about my podcast. So I think that sharing, and then you having me as a guest on your podcast, is maybe one reflection of abundance mindset, right?
My girlfriends call that co-opetition, where in that where the places where there might be traditional competition, where we're talking about the same things, but if we collaborate, we actually make each other better. Yeah. And I love that you just highlighted that once again for me, of how beautiful that synergy can be.
Yeah. Well, and that podcast group that I mentioned earlier, I think is an example of trying to foster that abundance mindset. Look, people have limited amount of time. Mm-hmm. Our podcasts are competing for people's time and attention. Sometimes we're competing for guests, or sometimes we have the same guest on multiple podcasts. But I think this idea of helping each other out is something I appreciate. But even going back to, say, 2005, when I started blogging in this space around lean manufacturing, I could think of, off top of my head, there were maybe 4 or 5 other bloggers who were kind of part of that era where we may have had like the 5 most popular blogs in this space, partly a matter of being kind of early adopters of blogging. But within that group, there was, I can't remember one moment where people weren't incredibly supportive and promoting of each other instead of competing and trying to tear somebody else down. And so I've been fortunate to be part of groups like that.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you so much for being on the show. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you here today.
Well, thank you, Alisha. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.